Chapter 10 is very much a continuation of chapter 9 and these woes that are being decreed from Isaiah as this appeal for repentance. But this really is characterizing the wickedness of Israel in their rebellious period before the tribulation and in Isaiah's day before the Assyrian army had invaded. He's really trying to appeal that they would turn and experience deliverance, but instead they're doubling down on their wickedness to the point where their conscience is being seared. Wickedness burns like fire, and it's consuming like briars and thorns. It kindles the thickets of the forest, and the people become fuel for the fire. And they're betraying one another. And there's this terrible, darkness that's overcoming them in their wickedness as the tribulation overtakes them. And then he's continuing this in chapter 10. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees. He's indicting the moral malpractice of Israel's leadership during the rebellion. They're legislating wickedness, and they're Isaiah is echoing biblical warnings against demonically deceived leadership that's described and prophesied about in Psalm 82. Psalm 82 actually talks about how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And that's what they're doing here. The writers keep writing oppression. They're legislating wickedness. They turn aside the needy from justice. They rob the poor of the people of their right. The widow may be their spoil, that they may make the fatherless their prey. It's, again, a terrible wickedness and even betrayal of their duties as leaders. But will you in one day, what will you do on the day of punishment, this being the tribulation, in the day that will come from afar, or in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your wealth? Just saying, where are you going to get your help? And all of these other places where you've placed your trust that are going to fail you in that day, nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. For all his anger is not turned away and his hand is outstretched still. Isaiah is describing the brutality of the Antichrist invasion as Israel's wicked leaders have no recourse to mitigate God's judgment, but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. It's yikes. And again, now we're going to transition to actually judgment on the arrogance of Assyria. Even though the Lord has used Assyria as an archetype of Israel's final adversary, the Antichrist, he's using Assyria as an instrument of his judgment and discipline. God judges the pride of the Antichrist at the Messiah's arrival at Jerusalem. So while the defeat of the Assyrian army historically fulfilled portions of this chapter, much of this chapter still awaits future fulfillment at the end of the age. So he is talking about Assyria, but some of the promises in this chapter were not fulfilled in the days of Isaiah and Assyria, but will be fulfilled when the final archetype of Assyria appears as the Antichrist at the end of the age. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. I'm going to use Assyria and the Antichrist a little bit interchangeably in this video, because that's what Isaiah is doing as an archetype of the grand redemptive narrative. Woe to the Antichrist, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my fury. Against the godless nation I sent him. The godless nation being Israel. Man, who was that? It was in a recent week, I think in Amos, where the Lord calls Israel the godless nation. Against this godless nation I sent him. Against the people of my wrath I command him to take spoil and seize plunder and to tread them down like mire in the streets, but to a limit. He's saying, I have a limit of the discipline that I'm sending on Israel, not to utterly destroy them. We've covered that pretty well in previous weeks, how the Lord said, I'm not going to utterly destroy you. Hosea said that, Moses said that, Amos said that. This is not to utter destruction. But in the eyes of the Antichrist, for him, his motive is for the utter destruction of Israel. See, verse 7, but he, the Antichrist, does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. He's not going to try to obey the limits that would be within the Lord's purposes. But in his heart, it is in his heart to destroy, to annihilate, and to cut off nations, not a few. He's saying, I'm using him as redemptive discipline on a certain number of nations, on certain nations, but his appetite exceeds God's redemptive purposes to where he thinks he can take all the nations. He can utterly destroy Israel and claim their mantle for himself and become the ruler of the nations. It's not so much to say that it's to say that he doesn't realize he's being used as God's instrument, but his appetite for conquest overextends God's intention. And the Antichrist is convinced he can utterly exterminate Israel. The Antichrist estimates that his generals are as mighty as a city that could withstand them, considering the God of Israel weaker than the false gods of other conquered lands. And it's not necessarily that, it's not maybe. You could say that the Assyrian, or the Antichrist, is reading far too much of his own press, assuming the credit for all his victories that were permitted by God. The Antichrist considers himself able to consume all the nations, but Isaiah hasn't outright said that the Antichrist claims to be God just yet, but we really seem to be at the threshold of this claim of deity that the Antichrist would claim for himself. For he says, verse 8, "Are not my commanders like kings?" He's saying, my generals are greater than the kings of these cities. My general is greater than this city, and my general is greater than that. My general is greater than them. And all my hands have reached out to the kingdoms of idols whose carved images are greater than those in Jerusalem and Samaria, being Israel. So shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols all that I've done to Samaria and all these other countries? But when the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion, when the Lord's redemptive purposes are completed, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria, or in the end of the age, the Antichrist, and the boastful look of his eyes. For he says, again as the Antichrist, by the strength of my hand, I have done it. He's claiming all the credit. I've done it for myself, by my wisdom, and for I have understanding. I have removed the boundaries of the people and plunder their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found the nest of wealth of the peoples. There's a lot to talk about there that we're going to get into in later weeks on the Antichrist manipulation of the global economy. Man, that's actually a huge topic, but here he is, giving us a glimpse. We're going to talk about a lot more in later weeks. The Antichrist hand has found a nest, like a nest, the wealth of the peoples. And as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth. I mean, it just sounds like he is just going on this global conquest. And there was none that moved a wing or opened a mouth or chirped, just saying he is just, you can tell his pride. It's remarkable. But here comes the Lord's response. Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or a saw magnify itself against him who wields it? As if a rod should wield him who lifts it. Like the rod is the Antichrist is gonna wield God, when it's really the other way around. It's God who's wielding the Antichrist. Or if a staff should lift him who is not wood. Therefore, the Lord of hosts will send wasting sickness among his warriors. Those generals he's so proud of are going to be plagued. And under his glory, a burning will be kindled, a burning of fire. This is at the arrival of the Messiah and their final deliverance. When the messianic armies are brought as the threshing sledge against the Antichrist armies, which we looked at in Micah. The light of Israel will become a fire against the Antichrist, and the Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and briars on that day. Just as the Antichrist had just said, haven't I done all these things to these other nations? Shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols what I've done to everybody else? The Lord says, no. The light of Israel will become a flame, and its Holy One, the Holy One being the Messiah, will be a flame. The light of Israel will become a fire, and the Holy One, the Messiah himself, will become a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day. The glory of his forest and all the fruitful land. And scholars have debated back and forth if the forest is a metaphor for his armies, or if it's actually like his resources, his land. And I tend to think, with several other more conservative scholars, that he is actually talking about the resources of the Antichrist, not just his forest of his armies. even though that's what we've just talked about, but it's actually further than that. It's actually invading into the land and the resources. The Lord will destroy both soul and body, and it will be as when a sick man is wasted away. The remnant of his trees, of the trees of his forest, will be so few that a child can write them down. Now, here's why I think this is more than just the armies, but it's actually invading into the territory and resources of the Antichrist. I've included this in the notes because we find this in Micah chapter 5. Here's Micah. Let's scroll up to chapter 5. This song that Micah includes. And he shall be their peace, the Messiah. The Messiah will be their peace. When the Assyrian comes into our land and treads on our places, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. And we talked about that figure of speech, essentially that the Messianic army has its own generals. The Messianic army appoints its own authority and sends them into the territory of the Antichrist. They shall shepherd the land of Assyria. That's what I think we're talking about. When Isaiah is talking about they're going to hew his forests, basically, they're going to shepherd the land with a sword, the land of Nimrod and its entrances, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into the land and treads within our border. That's bigger than Assyria because that was not fulfilled in the days of Assyria. That was still awaiting fulfillment at the return of Israel's Messiah, at the return of Jesus. That's what I think Isaiah is talking about here in chapter 10, verses 18 and 19. Okay, let's move on. Then, in that day, the remnant of Israel, the survivors of the house of Jacob, will return, will no more lean on him who struck them, which really is referring to their captors, as they've been taken captive and they're forced to rely on any kind of care or provision from their captors. Instead of having to rely on their captors, they will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people be as the sands of the sea, saying, though your population was great, only a remnant can return. During the tribulation, there's terrible population collapse because of the distress of that time, which we've looked at in other weeks as well, already been substantiated by other prophets before Isaiah. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. Not destruction. Some people go back and forth about what destruction is decreed. Well, really, it's the destruction of the Antichrist. It's destruction that's being decreed against that wicked confederation. Because for the Lord of hosts will make a full end, as decreed. The full end. This is like the final deliverance, as decreed in the midst of all the earth. A global final deliverance. Obviously sounds like the end of the age. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrians when they strike with a rod or lift up their staff against you as Egypt did, for in a very little while my fury will come to an end and my anger will be directed to their destruction. This is interesting because there's a lot of covenant language being used here where he's appealing to Israel, saying, all of you who are repentant and righteous and that kind of thing, don't be afraid. It's okay. Even the righteous who are having to endure the tribulation, don't be afraid when the Assyrian comes to strike you, as the Egyptians did, for in a little while my fury will come to an end. He's saying the cup of my wrath is going to be transferred. Though during the tribulation, the cup of God's wrath, being the covenant curses of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, that they're experiencing during the tribulation, will transfer from Israel to the Antichrist on that final day of deliverance. When the tribulation purposes have been complete, the cup of God's wrath transfers and it's focused on the Antichrist. And the Lord of hosts will wield against them a whip, as when he struck Midian. Again, we're talking about the Gideon army again. And even though you're just a remnant, don't worry, we're going to do the Gideon thing again. And his staff will be over the sea and will lift it as he did in Egypt. Talking about this deliverance, like what they saw when they came out of Egypt, those plagues of Egypt, all of that hand of the Lord is going to be raised again against the Antichrist and these wicked nations. And in that day, his burden will depart from your shoulder and his yoke from your neck, and the yoke will be broken because of the fat. Okay, interestingly, because of the fat, what is that about? Commentators go back and forth, but God reassures Jewish captives in the tribulation that the cup of his wrath is going to transfer God will sovereignly judge the wicked confederation as he judged Egypt with the plagues and liberated the captives. Now, there's an interesting couple cross references because when the Messiah returns, specifically setting the captives free, those captives are being described as being supernaturally strengthened and rejuvenated. And so as they are being strengthened at the arrival of their Messiah, there's this breaking of the bonds that happens as they're being strengthened. Micah chapter 2, verse 13 says, we're describing the Messiah as coming, opening up the breaches before them. He's breaking the gates ahead of them so that they can pass through out of their captivity. And their kings pass on, their king, being the Messiah, passes on before them. The Lord is at their head, strengthening them. Micah chapter 5 says, and the remnant of Jacob will be among the nations in the midst of many peoples where they've been taken captive, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of the sheep, as they're being strengthened and actually equipped for war to come and destroy the Antichrist armies. Very fascinating. So that's what's really being, I'm assuming, referenced there. And then there's this kind of trail. There's this geographical path that's being described, and commentators really struggle to identify specifically what this is referring to historically. They want to pin it down to a path that's used by Assyria in the generation of Isaiah, and they really struggle with it because Assyria invades Israel several times, and each time is a little bit different, and they're not certain that any one of them exactly match up to this path. But I'll kind of show you the path. I have included a map in the notes to try to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what this path looks like. So I really want to encourage you, check out the notes, and I will try to put it on screen so you can see a little bit. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, I've tried to circle some of them on this map. This full map is available in the notes so that you can see it. It is kind of small, but we're looking at Bethel. So we're north of Jerusalem, still probably south of Galilee, but north of Jerusalem, and this path that they take toward the south. Oh, Jericho, way over there, Jericho. So here is Bethel, and then you can start to see Michmash, Geba, Ramah. All of these little places are in this path between Bethel all the way down to Nob, which is really right on the doorstep of Jerusalem. There's the Mount of Olives, there's Jerusalem. So you have Nob kind of at the bottom of, or on the ascent toward Jerusalem. I wanted to try to show you that there, but it is in the notes so that you can see it maybe a little bit better there. But essentially, as they come to Nob, this is what they say. The Assyrian, but the Antichrist, will shake his fist at the mount of the daughter of Zion, at Jerusalem. But behold, the God of hosts will lop the bows with terrifying power. He's just going to start hewing them down, and the lofty will be brought low, saying, the Lord himself is going to deliver Israel before they can get into Jerusalem and fully conquer it. The Lord arrives, their Messiah arrives, and just starts destroying their army. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an axe. Lebanon will fall by the majestic one. You know, you would think if there's anybody from Lebanon reading Isaiah, they're like, great, thanks a lot, Isaiah. Because he's been talking about Syria on the east and Gaza on the west. And he's talking about Assyria in the north. And then here, let's just throw Lebanon in there as well. Now, interesting, there might actually be something to the inclusion of Lebanon, which we can include as one of the characters that we try to track as we go through the remainder of these prophecies. That's actually a mention of Lebanon possibly being included in what would be the army being destroyed. Okay, that brings us to chapter 11.